You can see the screen. Great. So what I'm going to talk today about is how to reduce your risk of memory decline or dementia. Now why isn't it advancing? Great. So this is what I'm going to try and cover today. We're going to do a quick quiz. So I have just a couple of questions. And then we'll get into the meat of it. So I'm going to talk about what the risk factors for dementia are. So what are the things that put you at a higher risk for dementia? There are some things that we can't prevent. We're just born with these factors, and so there's really not much we can do, but there's lots of things that are potentially preventable or avoidable. So then that leads to what can we do to stave off dementia or cognitive decline? What are the things that I would recommend that we can try to do to try and reduce our risk of memory problems? And then, as we are in the middle of this pandemic, I thought that I would talk a little bit about how this COVID pandemic has affected our risk for memory problems. So I thought there's not research on it yet, but I'm just going to speculate and ask about, how has this last 18 months with increased isolation, with reduced social contacts, and various other things that have happened because of the pandemic, how do I think that might affect our risk for memory problems in the future? So I thought I would bring that in as well. So let's start off with a quiz if everybody's okay with that. So people could just answer the quiz to themselves. I won't be keeping marks or anything. So the first question that I have is, what do you think is the greatest risk factor for dementia? So of all of the things that put us at risk for dementia, what contributes the highest percentage? So the answers are, is it your genetics? Is it, who your parents were and what the genetic risk is? Or is it the aging process? In other words, we do know that as we get older, particularly after the age of 70, the risk of dementia goes up. But is that the greatest risk factor? Or is it smoking? So if you are a smoker, we do know that there is a higher risk of developing dementia. Is that the biggest risk factor? Or is it the female gender? So 1 to 4, is it genetics? Is it aging? Is it smoking? Or is it female gender? So which do you think it is? Give you a second to think about that. So in fact, if we look at all those 4 factors, by far the greatest contributor to your risk for dementia is your genetics. Okay, so who you picked as your parents actually determines the highest likelihood of you developing dementia. For example, if you have a first-degree relative, like your parents, a brother or sister, who has dementia, then your risk is about 2 to 2.5 times higher of developing dementia than a person who doesn't have a first-degree relative with dementia. If we look at a person with dementia, we would say that probably 60% of that risk is determined by a person's genetics. So while aging certainly contributes, and if you're a smoker, that contributes, by far the greatest contributing factor is actually genetics. Okay, so question number 2. How many people got that right? Question number 2 is, which of these problems has been associated with an increased risk of cognitive changes or dementia? Okay, so there's 4 things that I've written, but I've also given multiple choice type answers. So of all of the things that we've studied, which are the factors that have been associated with a higher risk? So is it reduced hearing? Does reduced hearing increase your risk? Or is it drinking alcohol to excess, more than 3 drinks a day? Is it depression? And when I talk about depression here, I mean untreated depression, particularly untreated depression that happens as you get older. Or is it smoking? Or is it 2 and 4, drinking and smoking? Or is it all of the above? So I'll give you a quick chance to think about that. So how many think it's just number 1? How many think it's just 2? How many think it's 3? How many think it's 4 or smoking? Or how many think it's 2 and 4, but not 1 and 2, 1 and 3? And how many think it's all of the above? Yeah, so it is all of the above. So we do know that all of those first 4 factors significantly increases people's risk for dementia. Okay, next question. So this is just a true or false question. So if you have a regular normal diet with relatively normal vitamin B and D levels in your system, taking extra vitamin D or B complexes, particularly B6 and B12, that has been proven to reduce your risk of dementia. So if you take extra supplements of vitamin D and vitamin B, has it been proven to reduce your risk for dementia? How many think that that's true? And how many people think that that's false? Well, actually it's false. So when we look at taking extra supplements, we do know that if your vitamin D, B6, and B12 levels are low, taking supplements can help. But if you have a pretty normal, regular diet with normal levels in your system, taking extra amounts of vitamin D and B complexes hasn't shown to reduce your risk. Great, so that's it in terms of the quiz. And one other question that I want you to think about, and as I mentioned, I'm going to cover this at the end of my talk, but the question that I want you to think about is, do you think that the COVID pandemic has affected your memory? And I think in the question and answer period, that's something that I'd love to hear from people about. So when we have a chance to talk about this, that's one of the questions that I'm going to ask you. So the COVID pandemic has led to many, many things that are different in our lives. A lot more social isolation, increased anxiety, many, many things have affected us for the last 18 months. And my question is do you think that that has caused you to have maybe slightly worse memory problems? Or do you think it might affect your memory in the future? So that's something that I want you to think about so that we can discuss it at the end of my talk. There isn't any research on this yet. We don't actually have any, academic clear clinical data on this, but I'm just going to speculate as to how I think the pandemic might have affected our memory or cognitive function. Great. So before I get into the meat of my talk, I thought I would just clarify a couple of things. So we often use the term dementia versus Alzheimer's disease. And so many people ask me, well, what's the difference? Is dementia and Alzheimer's disease the same? And just to clarify that dementia is just a global term or an umbrella term that we use for all diseases that cause cognitive or memory problems. There's over 140 diseases that cause dementia. It just so happens that Alzheimer's disease is one of those diseases, and it is the most common. So it accounts for anywhere between 50 and 60% of all causes of dementia. But there are many other conditions like Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, stroke-related dementia. As I said, there's over 140 different diseases that fit into the category of dementia. So dementia meaning memory or cognitive decline that affects function. But Alzheimer's disease is one of those specific diseases. So dementia is the global term. Alzheimer's disease is one of the diseases under dementia. The second term I wanted to talk about is mild cognitive impairment. So mild cognitive impairment is something that I see in my practice almost as much as I see people with dementia. So these people are people with very mild memory loss, but the memory loss is not bad enough to affect that person's function or ability to do things. So they may have a little bit of short-term memory difficulty, a little bit of trouble concentrating, and it's documentable. So if we did memory tests on these people, they clearly show a decline from what we would normally expect for their memory function. But it's not severe enough to cause memory problems. A lot of people think that this mild cognitive impairment is just a precursor state to people developing Alzheimer's or dementia. That, if we wait long enough, all these people will end up with dementia, that it's just an early stage. But when we actually look at people with mild cognitive impairment, 40% will go on to have dementia, and most of those will actually have Alzheimer's disease. But 40% remain the same after 10 years. So their memory doesn't actually get worse. And 10% actually get better over the next 4 or 5 years. So having mild cognitive impairment doesn't guarantee that you're going to go on to have dementia. So that's why I see a lot of these people and follow a lot of these people in my clinics to see, is their memory getting worse or is it staying the same? And occasionally we'll see people actually get a little bit better. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about before I go on to talk about dementia and the causes of dementia is a condition called age-related memory problems. So as we get older, particularly after we hit the age of 75, all of us, unfortunately, are going to experience a degree of memory problems. Now, these are very mild, usually affect short-term memory, usually does not cause any functional problems. So we can still go to the bank, take our pills, cook, use the remote, all those things. We don't lose any function because of this. One of the things that's very common in age-related memory changes is that we have difficulty with our attention and particularly with our mental flexibility. So what do I mean by mental flexibility? I mean that when I look at my kids, for example, they're able to work on the computer, watch TV, go on their phone, and feed the cat, all at this, doing that simultaneously, and be able to maintain their function in each of those 4 or 5 different tasks. They can actually change their attention from task to task to task very quickly and be able to accomplish them. As we get older, our ability to shift our focus and our attention declines. And so multitasking at the same time becomes a little bit more difficult for us. So whereas 20 and 30-year-olds might be able to do 3 or 4 different tasks at the same time, for a lot of us, it becomes more difficult and we have to focus on 1 or 2 tasks. The other thing that is noticeable with age-related memory problems is word finding. So word finding definitely becomes more of an issue as we get older. And these changes are inevitable. For some people it happens in their 60s, some in their 70s, some in their 80s, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're developing dementia. Many of us notice these changes, but most of us won't go on to have problems with dementia. Okay, so let's talk about the risk factors for dementia. As I said, the common way for us to classify these are these things that we can do something about, and are these things not preventable or avoidable? So the not avoidable things or not preventable things are things like your family history or genetics. Obviously, you can't pick who your parents were. There are some things that are being tried in terms of manipulating people's genetics, but we're really not there yet. So unfortunately, who you picked as your parents, you can't change that. And that does confer the highest risk in terms of percentage of risk. Aging. So all of us are getting older. I certainly have noticed it over the last couple of years. And that's, again, something that we can't prevent or stop. The interesting thing is most people have felt that the older you get, the higher your risk for dementia, but that actually isn't quite true. So it's definitely true that after the age of 65, the older you get, the higher the risk until you hit your late 80s and 90s. So at the late 80s, like 88, 89 years old, the risk of dementia actually plateaus and it starts to go down. So if you have not developed dementia So let's say a 60-year-old, the risk of dementia is less than 1%. When you're 75, that risk may go up 10%. And when you're 85, that risk may be as high as 30%. But once you hit 88, and if you haven't developed dementia, that risk doesn't go up to 50 or 60%. In fact, it seems to plateau at about the maximum of about 30% risk. So if you manage to escape dementia when you're 88, 89, then the risk is really relatively low that you'll develop dementia after that. Other things that are not preventable, genetic diseases like Down syndrome. So I see a lot of people who are in their late 50s, early 60s with Down, and unfortunately all of them, if they live long enough, will develop Alzheimer's dementia. There are other medical problems that you can't avoid, things like Parkinson's disease, Huntington's. There's many medical conditions, stroke. If you have those conditions, you have a significant risk for dementia. Okay, so let's switch to things that you can do something about. So potentially preventable risk factors. Probably the biggest one that people have been studying lately is inactivity. So when people are sedentary, particularly in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, people who are sedentary have 2 to 3 times higher risk of developing dementia than those who remain active. And the interesting thing is the activity doesn't have to be vigorous activity. I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about what we can do, but it's actually just moderate exercise like walking. And the requirements are typically less than an hour a day for 3 days a week. We also know that poor diet increases your risk for dementia. The next factor is excess alcohol use. And the studies have shown that if you have more than 3 drinks a day, it definitely puts you at higher risk for dementia. There's actually 2 different dementias that are put you at higher risk for with alcohol use. Alcoholic dementia, which is something that we see, but drinking excess alcohol also puts you at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease as well. The cardiovascular risk factors, so things that increase your risk for having heart attacks and strokes, all of those things like being overweight, high cholesterol levels, high blood pressure, smoking, and poorly controlled diabetes. Not only do they put you at higher risk for having strokes and heart attacks, but they also put you at risk for dementia in general and do put you at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease specifically. The next factor is untreated depression. So depression and anxiety that happens as you become a senior, if it goes unchecked or untreated, puts you at higher risk for dementia. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Smoking. So we do know that people who are smokers have a higher risk for dementia. And then more recent findings, studies have shown that air pollution. So I think it's a very similar link to smoking. People who live in urban centers, who've lived there for more than 25 years, where there is a high amount of air pollution, have a 2 times higher risk of developing dementia compared to people who live in rural settings with no air pollution. The other potentially preventable risk factor is head trauma. So we do know from studies from athletes like football players, hockey players, soccer players, but also people who've suffered head trauma throughout their lives, the risk of developing dementia is higher in those who have suffered head trauma. When we look at athletes like football players and some hockey players, unfortunately the dementia often occurs when they're in their early 50s. So it actually happens quite a bit younger than we usually see. Vitamin deficiencies, so I talked about vitamin B6 and B12, folate, and vitamin D. If you are low in these vitamins, maybe because of your diet, or maybe because of inherent inability to absorb them, it can put you at risk for dementia. Also taking certain medications for longer periods of times, so sedatives, things that sleep aids, for example, or painkillers, particularly the painkillers like morphine derivatives. They can put you at higher risk of developing dementia Typically, when I talk about taking these medications, though, I'm talking about taking them for a long period of time. So if you have, a molar taken out, a wisdom tooth taken out, and if you take some Tylenol 3s for, a few days, that doesn't put you at higher risk. It's taking them for prolonged periods of time that put you at higher risk. And then the other thing that we've been finding out more and more about is that uncorrected hearing loss definitely puts you at higher risk for developing dementia. So when they've studied people with hearing loss that is uncorrected, they don't wear hearing aids, there's definitely studies that showed that the risk of dementia gets higher. So knowing that there are not preventable things like our aging and our genetics, but knowing that there are things that are preventable, well, what can we do to stave off dementia? What can we do to try and maintain our cognitive abilities? So the first thing that I would recommend to people, the first two things, is to remain both mentally active and physically active. So I'm going to talk about the physical first. As I mentioned, it doesn't have to be running or swimming laps. It could be as simple as walking, but the consistency is very important. So you have to do it 2 to 3 to 4 times a week. And the cumulative effect, you have to have about 150 minutes of moderate activity per week. Okay, so 2.5 hours of walking, if you can manage that during the week, that would be sufficient to reduce your risk of dementia. Remaining mentally active, so doing things like crossword puzzles, attending this session, doing word games, doing Sudoku, or you could do memory training things on the computer. I don't know how many people have heard of Lumosity, but there are many programs now available where you can actually challenge yourself mentally on the computer. And so staying mentally active. And interestingly, again, the consistency is the important thing. So doing it 3 to 4 times a week. In this case, it's about 20 minutes a day of mental activities can actually maintain your cognitive function. The third thing is remaining socially active. So having 2 to 3 social interactions with someone other than your spouse is what people have studied. And if you do that, then your risk of developing dementia is lower. So they're saying 2 to 3 social interactions per day, at least 3 days a week. You can also look after your cardiovascular risk factors. So make sure your blood pressure is under control, make sure your cholesterol, your diabetes is under control, try and reduce your weight if you're overweight. All of those things that we try to do to prevent heart attacks and strokes, if we do them, they also protect us from dementia or reduce our risk. Other things that we can do, if you have depression and anxiety, you should seek treatment. And the treatment I'm talking about is a combination of counseling and medications. So that seems to be the best intervention. So a combination of counseling and medications. And if you do that, then your risk of dementia is lower. Get a good sleep. So many of us who get older suffer from insomnia or have sleep trouble. The interesting thing is if you treat the insomnia with medications like sedatives, that actually makes things worse. So you have to try and get better sleep naturally. So do things like maintain good sleep hygiene. Reduce your naps to 20 minutes a day. Don't watch TV or work on the computer half an hour before you go to sleep. Don't drink coffee or caffeinated products after 3 in the afternoon. Make sure that your room is dark and quiet and cool. That will help you sleep. So the heat wave that we suffered through the last 60 days hasn't been great for sleep. And then other things like exercise. So exercise is important to improve your sleep, but we suggest to people do not exercise vigorously after 5 o'clock in the evening. Okay. Other things that you can do, treat your hearing loss. So if you do have hearing loss, it would be worthwhile to get it tested and to get a hearing aid if that's recommended. Keep alcohol intake to an average of 1 drink per day or less. Eat a healthy diet. The interesting thing is the recommendations are people should take a vitamin D and B complex and possibly vitamin C, even though taking these supplements, if you have a good diet, hasn't been proven to be effective. And the reason why we say it's okay to take the supplements is because you can't overdose on supplements. So vitamin D, B, and C are water-soluble vitamins. So if you take too much, you just pee them out. It doesn't accumulate in the system. So on the off chance that you're low in these vitamins, taking supplements may help. And then avoid certain medications. So if you're worried about memory loss or developing memory loss, you should talk to your doctor, and they would have a list of medications that put you at higher risk. Things like sedatives in particular, but also certain, for example, cholesterol medications. There was one cholesterol medication that was associated with memory problems. Okay. So that's it in terms of things that I think that we could do to try and stave off memory problems, or and things that we can try and do. I do want to spend some time asking people questions about how they think COVID has affected your memory. But in my mind, thinking about this, unfortunately, I think the pandemic has increased our risk of developing memory problems. And I'm going to talk about sort of some of the things that I think that have happened. Again, this is not based on research. There are a couple of studies that have been started that people are going to be looking at this, but it's probably going to take at least a year and maybe even 2 years before we'll have any results. But thinking about COVID and the pandemic, I'm not talking about people who actually got COVID, so got the virus. We do know that some people suffer neurological effects from COVID if they have severe disease. But I'm talking about the people who did not get COVID, but had to do things like, all of us had to socially isolate. All of us were definitely affected by the pandemic and the restrictions from the pandemic. So I think those restrictions did increase our risk in many ways. So the first thing is that I think that we had less mental stimulation. Some have increased their learning, so they have learned how to Zoom. So all of you probably had to learn how to Zoom because of the pandemic, or do FaceTime. But I think in general, most of us have had reduced mental stimulation because of the social isolation and the restrictions. So we've had less social contacts. I know that for sure. That the number of people we've interacted with face to face have definitely decreased because of the pandemic and the restrictions. There's been lots of studies that show that our physical activity has decreased during the pandemic. So on average, people are exercising less. It's partly because you couldn't go to gyms during the majority of the pandemic. People were doing things like walking, but in general, the studies have shown that the amount of physical exercise we got during the pandemic was less. There's also been some suggestion that alcohol use has increased during the pandemic. So people are drinking more, partly because there's fewer things to do. I can remember a number of times that we've gone on Zoom meetings with family, and suggestion is everybody bring a glass of wine, right? And normally when we did FaceTime, we wouldn't have been drinking. So, but there's been some studies that show that the use of alcohol has increased during the pandemic. And then the other factor I think that is going to increase our risk is the fact that during the pandemic, it's been harder for us to access medical help. So if we have high blood pressure, if we have high cholesterol, or if we have diabetes, it was harder and continues to be harder to get together with your family doctor to get these things checked and under control. And so I think, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, many of us have had a higher risk that our cardiovascular risk factors have not been in check. And because of that factor, I think it's going to lead to a higher risk of dementia or cognitive problems. So my general impression is, unfortunately, the pandemic has not been good for our cognitive function. That in general, as a population, I think that we're going to start to notice that more people are suffering from memory problems or cognitive losses, partly because of the restrictions and the social isolation from the pandemic. Great. I do notice a chat. I'm just going to check that real quick. Question. Oh, so someone asked how much B complex is recommended, also how much vitamin D for age 72. So that's a great question. So the recommendation for vitamin D is 2,000 international units a day. And so most of the supplements are 1,000 international unit supplements. Some of them are 2,000. So just check, and it's 2,000 international units a day is the supplement. And the B complex, most of the B complexes are a combination of B6, B12. Often they have a little bit of folate. So just one tablet a day of any of the supplements would be sufficient. Great. So, Diane, should we open it up to questions?
Sure, yeah, if people want. I know some people have had issues with mics in the past, so if we just keep an eye on the chat, some people will
Okay,
end up
that's
typing
great.
their questions there. And then some people
So
are,
I think it might be Kathy that asked this question, but can you give strategies for discontinuing long-term sleep pill use? It seems impossible. And it is. That's one of the most challenging things that I encounter as a physician. Many people get started on a sleep medication. It might be because temporarily they've had, some anxiety, or another example is the death of a close family member and you can't sleep. And so you use a sleep aid for that period of time. And then once you're on them, it's really difficult to come off of them. So I think that it should be supervised, or your physician should be involved in that. One of the things that's really helpful is not to try to go cold turkey. So the best thing to do if you want to try and come off of a sleep aid is to get off of them very slowly. In fact, if people have been taking a sleep aid for more than a year, I tell them it's probably going to be 3 to 4 months of gradually reducing the dose before we're going to be able to get you off of it. All of the things that I talked about in terms of sleep hygiene, when you're trying to get off of sleep aids, it's critically important that you maintain all those sleep hygiene things, like no naps, avoiding TV and computer use half an hour before, caffeine, watch your caffeine. All of those things are really, really important when you're trying to come off of the sleep aids. And then the other thing that I would often suggest is switching from prescription sleep aid to something like melatonin. So often when people are trying to reduce their dose of a sleep aid, then I will supplement melatonin in with that sleep aid. So it takes the melatonin, and that might help you gradually reduce the prescription medication that you're on. I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think that it's something that you're going to need help from your family doctor from, because they can then tell you how to gradually reduce the dose of the medication that you're taking. Great. I think it answered the question. Good. Other questions people have, first of all? And then I guess if people have trouble unmuting, people can maybe make a comment in the chat. But my question to you is do you think that this pandemic, the restrictions and social isolation, do you think that that's affected your memory or cognitive ability? How many people would say yes to that?
It's Kathy.
Hi, Kathy. Thanks.
I have to say no.
No? That's great.
I don't think so, but others might debate that. I don't know.
Yeah, Verna
I
said
think,
yes.
yeah, I think that for me, it was finding other ways to connect with people. And, as you said, Zoom was a great one. Creating a Facebook page that was kind of a little community to keep in touch. Certainly keeping in touch with family as well. So
I found it really interesting during the pandemic because I was dealing with a lot of seniors, and like even in terms of some of our follow-up appointments, but also in terms of my family and the social contacts from my church, for example. And we seem to have sort of two groups. About 60% sort of were willing to embrace the technology. So they were willing to try Zoom, they were willing to try FaceTime, you know, they showed up for all of these things. And about 40%, there was a number of people who just absolutely refused. Like they would not go on Zoom. The only way that you could really contact them is by email or by phone. And so my suspicion is those people who were hesitant, that didn't like the technology, may have more an effect from this pandemic than those who embrace the technology. So all of you, good for you for willing to try Zoom and to maintain your contacts and your interests.
Thank you for the question, Roland. From my perspective, I would say no, but I got out ahead of it, I think, because immediately went back to work and started doing some consulting work. I was really concerned about the impact that it would have. Right. And I'm a social animal, and so I just had to maintain that and worked at it to be able to do that. I would say walked like crazy, and alcohol use, I don't recall it being anything different, and it took work though. Right. Yeah, it took work, and to be able to do that, and there were ups and downs for sure. I think the loss of connection with family, physical connection, was really difficult. Yes. And with the grandchildren living just down the street, it was even more difficult. Oh, yeah. But you know, we managed, and we did it. But you know, for people that struggled, I can't imagine what it was like. Right. Yeah.
Joey Grace said, I would have to say no, it hasn't worsened my problems, I guess. Working from home greatly reduced my stress. Yes. And that's a really interesting comment, because again, I think it's a half and half. Some people found the pandemic and being able to work from home, and you know, particularly people who are introverts, I think found that you know, the COVID pandemic and the isolation wasn't too bad. Right. And then other people who are more extroverted, who really rely on their social contacts and social interactions, found that this period could have been pretty stressful. So yes. Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think that the studies will be interesting coming out.
It will be.
Although again, I think that if you take the population as a whole, my suspicion is the pandemic has not been a great thing for cognitive function, because of those factors that I talked about.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think, like Diane said, I think we all had to, for those of us who maintain our social contacts and maintained our mental stimulation, we had to work at it. Like, it wasn't something that came easy. So you had to really be conscious about, for example, making sure you got out for your walk every day.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It would have been too easy to just say, well, I can't go out, I can't do this, I can't do that, I'm just watching TV.
Yeah, agree.
Great.
So Roland, are you going to pursue some research on this?
Not myself, although I know that there's a number of people who are currently doing that specifically.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
Good.
Great. I'll give people, oh, there's another chat question. So Kathy said, yeah, it took more effort and awareness for sure. Yep. So good for you, all of you, for getting out there. Great. So Diane, I think it's like 44 minutes after. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that information. I found it very interesting. I think I speak for everybody who joined us today. That was great information for us to learn, and we appreciate your time to spend with us. If anybody has any other questions, maybe pop them in here now, but otherwise we can get on with our days and find some ways to stimulate our brains, I guess. The rain, so everybody can go outside for a walk, and yeah. and it's not too smoky, so that air quality will be good for us too.
For sure. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thanks for the questions and comments from everybody. Really appreciate it. It's really nice to see lots of people, faces that I know. So,
Roland, if I just might add, you know, for us, we're privileged. We're very privileged in our life and having the ability to get out ahead of it as much as we could and work at it. But I would expect the majority of the population really struggled with this, and it'll be really interesting to see what some of the outcomes will be in the next few years.
I think you're absolutely right, Diane. So marginalized populations for sure suffered much more during the pandemic. So
for sure.
I think that we're going to find even the cognitive effects from the pandemic are going to affect them much more so than people of privilege. Yeah,
yes,
I think you're right.
For sure.
Thanks for that comment.
Thank you. And thank you.
Well, it's nice to see everybody.
Wishing you well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, have a great day, everybody. And don't forget to join us next Wednesday for the Aquafit. It's going to be a different time, not 10 o'clock in the morning. It's we hope that the weather will be warmer at 5 p.m. to get in the water. Westminster Pool, free. Bring your friends, even if they haven't registered on our website, whatever. We're welcoming all, and it should be a lot of fun to get into the water and get active that way. That should be lots of fun. Yeah, hope to see you there.
Thanks, Anne.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Thanks again, Roland. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.